Welcome everyone to Resilink's ongoing series covering the coronavirus outbreak and its effect on the global supply chains. This is our sixth update in the series. Our topic for today is how to adapt and monitor to the supply chain's new normal. My name is Mark Lumpkin. I'm with Resilink and I'll be the MC for this informative, data-driven presentation. We have with us today some of the top minds in supply chain management. Please know the slides and the replay will be available a short while after the webcast. During the webcast, feel free to use the chat feature to send us your questions. We will do our best to cover them during the call, or we'll follow up with you afterwards. For our agenda today, we will first provide you with an analysis on recent supply chain data. Second, we'll conduct a roundtable discussion among our experts to look at the outlook for supply chains, as well as how the workforce will need to adapt to the new normal. We will wrap up with a Q&A. Again, please use the chat feature to send us your questions. Today, you'll hear from supply chain expert and thought leader, Bindia Vakil. Bindia is Resilink's founder and CEO. She is credited with bringing supply chain risk management into the mainstream since founding Resilink in 2010. She holds the patent for evaluating supply chain vulnerability and risk of an enterprise. She is a founding member of the Global Supply Chain Resiliency Council and a member of the advisory board of MIT Center for Transportation and Logistics. She's managed billions of dollars in supply chains for major Fortune 500 companies. She's most recently published several articles in the Harvard Business Review and has been featured over the past few months in the Financial Times, NPR Radio, CNBC, Bloomberg Television, and numerous industry publications. Today, we'll also get insights from John Bovett. John is a member of the leadership team of Resilink, where he works with customers and strategic partners to improve supply chain resiliency. Prior to Resilink, he worked at KPMG, Ariba, and Oracle. We are also excited to have special guest Dr. Rob Hanfield. Rob is the Bank of America University Distinguished Professor of Supply Chain Management at North Carolina State University. He's also the director of the Supply Chain Resource Cooperative. The cooperative is a unique business and educational partnership to integrate students' projects into the MBA and undergraduate classroom. Rob has over 120 peer-reviewed journal articles, has published 8 books in supply chain management and procurement, and he's regularly quoted in global news media such as Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, and CNN. We're pleased to have Rob join us today from his office in Raleigh, North Carolina. Now I'll ask John to introduce our joint data collaboration between Resilink and North Carolina State and Dr. Hanfield. John?
Thanks, Mark, and welcome everyone again. I really appreciate it. I know we've been providing these updates every few weeks. We look forward to it. As you can see, we're also adding in some special guest speakers, and today is our good friend and partner and Rob Hanfield from NC State. We've been working with NC State and Rob and the team for quite a while now. We decided to also share some of our data with them. So as we now provide updates going forward, it'll be working in collaboration with the team over at NC State. I'll just quickly say go Pack for those of you that are NC State grads and can appreciate that. But welcome everyone, and welcome Rob. Appreciate you joining us today.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and we're really excited about the work that we're doing with Resilink. We're using Resilink in the classroom, in our online MBA, and in the undergraduate classroom as well. You guys have put together a great classroom feature for learning, for students to allow them to learn how to do that. And on this workshop that we've been working on with the analytics, I want to do a shout out to Ronald Gonzalez, Antonio Suarez, Amos, and Balaji, who are all graduate students that have been doing a lot of the analytics behind the scenes and working with this data set. So great to be here today.
Yeah, thanks. Glad you're here. And we really look forward to continuing to do these data updates as well. And I think everyone, we have a lot of the people that continue to join with us, so welcome back.
Thanks.
And one of the things that I wanted to also cover is just for those of you that are new, maybe less familiar with Resolink. So I wanted to give a couple seconds on some backdrop just to put the data that we'll go through in context. The first is that Resolink's we've been doing this for 10 years, actually our 10th year anniversary. What a year to hit 10 this year. And we've been building up quite a bit of data over the years. We've been mapping, from multiple industry supply chains, from high tech, consumer electronics, life science, med device, semiconductor, pharma, auto, consumer packaged goods, just to name a few. And we've built up quite a bit of supply chain data around, what's going on around the world. We really have our kind of finger on the pulse and the DNA for these global supply chains, where we've been mapping these for our clients and gathering this data over a period of time. And then came COVID-19, and now I think we've been able to add something back into the research and conversation. Thus, our partnership with NC State to help us, using and analyzing the anonymized data, but get that their research expertise, their analytics, and in particular Rob and his team's expertise on the data. And I think you'll see that as we, not only today but then moving forward. So that's exciting. And as I mentioned, a lot of this data we've mapped. We've covered over 135 countries. Lots of part level data, sub-tier data, so that's sort of a base of, as we're helping customers, map, monitor, and protect their supply chain. So that was, what we've been doing, obviously in our day job. What then came COVID-19, and what we wanted to do is leveraging our data that we've been collecting, particularly from the disruption data since January, effectively, is that we now can see actually the disruptions as they're occurring since then. And then and so there's a few data points a few items that I wanted to cover just to lay the foundation. The first is that we're monitoring through our EventWatch product, we're monitoring for disruptions. And what we also do is not only notify our customers of these events and the disruptions that are going on as they occur in real time, but we're also able to then send a notification to a supplier, an individual supplier, for their particular site if it was impacted, and ask them for a confirmation. So this is important because this is the basis of the data that we're providing, and some of the insights. Today, we've actually started doing this over the last few sessions. But just as a refresher, a supplier can, receive this notification that their site was in a potential disruption. We ask them for confirmation. They can actually say yes, confirmed, or no impact. If they confirm, they actually can also provide additional data, such as how many weeks they expect to be impacted. So this allowed us, it's sort of like monitoring a patient. We can actually take a look at this data over a period of time, which is what we've been doing, and we'll touch on some of our insights and updates for today. But so far, since this time, we've been collecting this data, specifically since COVID-19 started. We now have 38,578 sites impacted, and that covers 1,585 distinct suppliers. So we have, I think, if you look at this data as sort of dynamically surveying the population of suppliers to see what's going on, it's a pretty interesting global survey on an ongoing automated basis. So it gives us some very unique insights, and that's the reason why we wanted to pull in some other experts from NC State. So moving on to some of the data points that we wanted to cover. So basically what we're seeing right now is what this chart is showing. Let me first cover what it's showing. So it's showing quite a few data points kind of mapped together. Let me cover them. So the first is you can see that the black line represents the number of events, or call those disruptions. That's sort of the heartbeat, right? So as that line goes up, that means that more suppliers and more supplier sites are confirming or being impacted. And so you can see that there's like a peak around, one small peak around February 10th, and then it continues, and then it goes up again around mid-March. Okay, so that's important. Let's keep that in mind. And then the other side of it, those bar chart part of it, is the maximum downtime that was reported. So what does that mean? So that means, remember what I just said was suppliers can confirm impact, and if they confirm, they can also provide downtime. And so those numbers are representing the max. And you can see, and what we've reported in previous webinars is the max we were seeing was 16 weeks. It went from 1 to 16 weeks delay. And you can see what's fascinating about this is a couple things. First, we did notice a factory in Thailand reporting 52 weeks. So that's sort of an outlier, as highlighted on the chart. We're researching if that was an error or actual downtime, but it's sort of an outlier. So we just sort of tabled that for a minute. But the other thing that we noticed, and what's neat about this chart, is you can clearly see the delay of impact causing downtime. So you notice that the line goes up in terms of impacts, and then the delays sort of happen a couple weeks, a week, 2-3 weeks later. It actually is what you'd expect, but we can see the data here. So it's fascinating to be able to plot this over time. And as we've mentioned before, we'll continue to do this and report back to everyone sort of the progress. Now, the other thing that we did on this chart was just to kind of highlight some of the key news items that were also occurring on the timeline from January all the way into April. And you can see it's interesting to see the essential impacts of the lockdowns as they occurred globally. So you can sort of, by mapping all of these together, it's interesting to kind of see the timeline, the heartbeat, and what's going on.
I can just to add to that, John.
Go ahead, Rob.
What we look for other sort of correlations between different items in the data. We didn't really find any, but as we said here, the shutdowns here are really what are triggering the disruptions. And the reason, of course, is as a government shutdown occurs, workers no longer go to work. And what is unique about this COVID event is that it impacts everybody. Impacts the food supply chain, electronics, healthcare, industrials. Everybody is impacted because of the fact that these shutdowns, these government shutdowns, are sending workers home.
Thanks, Rob. And just continuing down this, looking at, and basically what we're trying to do, as you'll see from previous webinars, is trying to give some incremental insights as we see them and observe, and then as Rob's team kind of comes up with additional data points and an analysis. But what we noticed was 1 in 4 COVID incidences caused downtime during February and March. And what's interesting is that from here, as you can see, I guess there's kind of 2 charts, one on the left. So the first one, you can clearly see the amount of confirmed impacts. There's kind of bubbles on the top there. So most in China, and then China sort of started not being as bad, and then it started impacting and getting confirmations from the US over time. And you can see that as you kind of go to the right-hand chart, you can actually see that the disruptions by country, and you can see the U.S. is the top. It was the top in previous reportings as well, and Malaysia follows closely there. So you can see it's interesting, and we'll touch on, as we were kind of preparing for today and having some internal discussions. I know Bindia and Rob and I were discussing, well, why is Malaysia so high? And it's obviously because they're such a huge manufacturing center. And then followed by China and the Philippines, and then Mexico. So it starts to trail off by the different countries as you go down, but you can see clearly the top sort of impacted countries. Rob, any comments before I?
A couple of things, actually. Malaysia, as you know, is a high-tech hub, and the government there, when they say there's a lockdown, they really mean it. So they literally lock down everybody, and those factories come down. You can also kind of see that it does occur in waves, starting with China and then kind of spreading into the US and other parts of the world. We're also looking at, maybe trying to simulate the distribution of events. One of our concerns is there going to be a second wave of COVID and a second wave of shutdowns? And if so, we're trying to build a sort of a predictive model and try to see what that might look like.
Yeah, that's exciting because I think we're starting to see that, right, Rob? We can start to see some leading indicators, which we'll touch on a little bit today, and then obviously give more updates as we kind of develop some models. And would be great to be able to come up with the more predictive, because that's what everyone's looking for, is how can we more accurately predict some of these things. And if you take a look at some of the other dimensions. This chart's showing the average downtime reported by supplier and by country, and you can see that USA and China are obviously high up, and as we mentioned, Malaysia as well. So this is another interesting chart. To look at the just to kind of continue and kind of analyze, look at by country a little bit more and dig in. You can see that from the USA's perspective, California as we know, was the first state to issue a stay-at-home order on March 19th. And you can actually see that there was a lot of suppliers disrupted in that time, and that the max downtime peaked. It started going up from the black line, and then eventually kind of, there was a big bump around March 16th for the maximum downtime. As the disruptions continued over time, you can see these other kind of peaks as downtime actually continued. And then looking at Malaysia, this was another interesting one. And as Rob mentioned, the Malaysia lockdowns, when they do it, it's I think similar to China in that they can really lock down pretty substantially. What was interesting about this one in particular, when we looked at this chart, is you can actually see that the lockdowns occurred by one factory. So the max downtime peaked up even before we started seeing a lot of reported confirmations from suppliers and the impacts. So they were actually kind of ahead of the curve in this case, which is an interesting example for us to dig in a little bit more and and analyze. Rob, I don't know if you have a comment on this one. I know we were talking about it a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think in, like I said, places like Malaysia, when there's a shutdown, it shuts down permanently for some time. I think in all of these regions, there are local conditions that are impacting shutdowns on top of COVID. For instance, in China, you also had, the Chinese New Year that also contributed to the longer length of downtime. But a lot of the suppliers in these places really don't know how long they're going to be down. It's all dependent on what the government allows them to do. And if you ask a lot of them, they say we don't know. It could be 8 weeks, it could be 15 weeks, it could be 20 weeks. We don't know. And I think Malaysia is no exception here.
I think one other thing to add on to the Malaysia situation in particular is I think it really highlights sort of the interlinkages of the supply chain as it relates to Thailand, Malaysia, China, Vietnam, and other countries. There's tremendous back and forth happening across the borders. There are components that are coming from China and Japan into Malaysia, processed in Malaysia, going back into Taiwan or China or Malaysia for further assembly, and then getting distributed to customers worldwide. And so I think the fact that Malaysia started to have factory downtime in February, March itself was a result not necessarily of the lockdown as much as running out of components or having disruptions related to supply of things that they were buying.
Yeah, that's a good point, Bindia. I think, thanks. I think that's one of the things we want to, as we're presenting some of these facts and data points and charts to everyone, because we wanted to get the data out there. But I think one of the goals of this initiative overall is to really dig into this and see what, like you suggested, is what caused. We suspect we know, but can we actually dig into what the causes were? And that's where we can start building out the predictive models that we were talking about. So it's exciting. Looking at China, if we remember, the Hubei province was locked down January 23rd. And as we can see, it was pretty early on that a lot of max downtime or downtime overall was reported. And as the China kind of went through this, they were sort of ahead of the curve in terms of the disruptions that we observed. And you can see they again sort of follow a similar trajectory from the relationship between the events that are going on in the impact events to the downtime being reported. So there's sort of a leading indicator there. But with China, you can see clearly that they were getting less and less impacted over a period of time, whereas they were improving and other countries were getting more impacted.
And one thing we didn't show here, John, is, when you see suppliers that have, 8 to 16 weeks of downtime, we don't, we kind of show that as cumulative here. So it's something that's going to continue, for a period of time, which is why you have that flat line. We think that some of these facilities are beginning to reopen in China, but it's unclear what's happening over there as well. So, some of the news reports we're hearing is there's some activity to go back to work, but they're not fully back to work yet.
Yeah, thanks, Rob.
A couple of things in China, in addition to the fact that the government is, all indications are that things are reopening. The reality on the ground is there are a lot of restrictions on companies and a lot of requirements that they have to be meeting, such as providing PPE to all of their employees. And I think we've mentioned it on our calls before, that even if one worker is diagnosed with COVID positive, then the entire site needs to shut down. So the requirements to continue operations are pretty stringent. Additionally, the factories are required to maintain social distancing throughout, and so the capacity being resumed is not 100% even now. Having said that, things are coming back, which is definitely good news, and things are stabilizing, which is really good too.
Yeah, I think we're even seeing it. Rob and I are in North Carolina, and where we have some factories, and I just noticed a report where if there was one case that it turns out after testing that a lot of the factory, I think it was like 20% of the factory workers were infected. So obviously, this is, if you magnify that across the world, that's one of the reasons why we wanted to touch on the workforce side of things today, also because you can just see the human factor in this is so substantial. But thanks, Bindia, thanks, Rob. And then also another area and country that we noticed was particularly impacted more recently, and you can see that they're sort of on the right-hand side of the chart, which is a little more recent, starting in towards the end of March, and then more recent now is Mexico. And Mexico was interesting because they never actually did any lockdowns. They started issuing curfews, and obviously, like every other place in the world, they were having their impacts. So you can see as the impacts start to grow, and the suppliers started reporting, 4 weeks. It looks like pretty consistent, 3-4 weeks of max downtime. So we observed that starting at the end of March. In terms of India is another country that's been on everybody's radar in terms of impacts. I think they were also a little more recent of being impacted. The lockdown was, I think, another example of a pretty significant lockdown, which took a little bit of time to kick in, but once it did, pretty substantial. And then they sort of did an initial kind of 1-day curfew on March 23rd, and then they a few days later completely locked down. And then you can see, as per our graph, matches that pretty closely in terms of there were some suppliers reporting impact, let's say even just the week before, and it quickly climbed where now we started seeing downtime delays coming out of India. Another one that we also have been monitoring very closely is the Philippines. And we noticed a couple of things that, again, as the line started in terms of impact started growing, we saw max downtime, hit pretty substantially, and it kind of grew quickly. And you can see that in this one, and it was again started around mid-March.
Yeah, I think one of the things you'll see here, John, is these are all sort of epicenters for COVID and epicenters of manufacturing. So anytime you get a pandemic that hits one of these countries where there's a lot of manufacturing sites closely together in these clusters, and they're all shut down at once, you're going to see a big jump. I will note, I think that some of the Asian countries and China are more likely to take a pandemic threat seriously, at least during this event, than other countries like Mexico and the U.S. that maybe let it slide a little longer and then felt the pain a little longer in the cycle.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I think what we wanted to do now, and we're sort of at that midpoint, I think, for today's discussion. We wanted to, and this is sort of the format that we've been getting good feedback on, is sort of present the data, have some discussions, and then have like a kind of a roundtable discussion. So we're going to transition to that. And as we mentioned, Rob will be included in that today. So Rob, I'm going to go to the next slide. I think this is some topics for you to talk about, and Bindi and I will contribute to the roundtable.
Yeah, no, it's a pleasure to be here today with everyone and with ResLink, and we really look forward to the ongoing work. One of the concepts that I have a co-author, Tom Linton, who's been on this call as well, and he and I are working on a book called. We wrote a book called The Living Supply Chain. We're working on one on the physics of supply chain. And one of the things that Tom mentioned to me one time is he said, when I was driving between Atlanta and Raleigh, I saw a group of these golden-winged warblers. There's kind of like a starling. And they're all flying in a cohesive pattern, and they're all moving and sort of guided together. And he noted that there was an expert in bird migration that studies these birds, and he said, the interesting thing about these birds is when there's a hurricane coming and it's hitting Florida, they will be in eastern Tennessee, and they know that hurricane is headed their way, and 2 days before they get there, they leave that region. And, that's an interesting idea that we observe in nature. But, the question then is, can supply chains kind of find this way to become more immune to potential threats that will be coming? And we've been kind of looking at the idea of supply chain immunity. And the idea behind supply chain immunity is just that. It's sort of the idea around demand sensing. Your body has antibodies in it that detect when there's an invader, and clearly that's what the vaccines are trying to do right now, is to develop an approach that can create these antibodies and injecting people with the antibodies that can fight this virus, and they're working hard to be able to do that. And likewise, if we could sense, our supply chains could sense that something is going on out there, and we can get early warning of it, then we have this. Could we create this innate immune system that becomes active the moment we detect that issue, and the system then can recognize an invader and goes into action immediately. And in the body, the cells will surround and engulf the invader and kill him. And likewise, I think we have to think of supply chains that can sense when there's a problem, and using tools like Resolink, they can get early notification of what was going on, and they can start to react to that. So a great example, is we were working with a large electronics provider, and they had early warning that there was going to be, a major issue in China with the COVID virus. So they immediately started to stock up supply. They immediately started identifying key suppliers that would be hit. They started, building that immunity in their system through extra inventory, extra supplies, notifying other suppliers, getting in touch with them, communication. That's the kind of activity I think that supply chain managers need to do in the face of these early warnings and early threats. And if we could be like a warbler and start flying away before the hurricane hits, gosh, we can avoid a lot of pain, and especially right now when a lot of people are feeling it, and we're all shut down. Our supply chains are shut down.
And Rob, I just absolutely love the analogies that between you and Tom Linton, you guys are the analogy kings. I love it. So the way we look at it is we almost feel like it's environmental sensing, right? It's that, we're today talking about COVID, and we're all kind of overwhelmed with COVID information right now. But really, let's not forget that even in the last few days alone, there has been more than COVID going on that is disrupting the supply chain. We've had hurricane season is starting in a few days. We have a massive hurricane hitting India, flooding in Michigan and other places. So, I mean, there's just a lot going on a near constant basis. Transportation disruptions, port outages, labor outages. And unfortunately, all these things that happen affect us in the coming days and weeks of our lives. We just don't know we're heading into trouble because nobody has given us that information. So having that environmental sensing capability tells us the pitfalls along the journey that we're on, that allows us to avoid those or be out of the way by the time it comes at us and altogether, like in your Warbler example. So I just think that going forward, that knowledge-based supply chain response is going to become more and more critical. And then sensing and detection is going to become sort of that, immediate and easily solvable problem that we can all adopt and implement throughout not just COVID, but all this other stuff that goes on every day that we have to deal with.
Thank you.
And so, John, if you go to the next slide really quickly, just to kind of bring that knowledge idea together, what we look at is it's information. If I were to tell somebody that there's a labor strike in France or there's a port disruption in Tianjin or something, if I can't make it meaningful, then it's just noise. So the way we look at this whole idea of sensing and detection is that we're combining the sensing data with relevant and actionable supply chain information, such as, okay, so this Tianjin port explosion that has just happened, well, do I have suppliers in the area that might be using the Tianjin port or any of the local logistics hubs that I might depend on? And so combining monitoring and sensing, environmental sensing and detection capabilities with the map of the geo-coded supply chain, knowledge of supplier dependencies in different geographies, as well as, most importantly, parts that come from those areas. In direct materials, everything comes down to part level. If someone tells me this supplier is affected in this area, I'm as a direct materials procurement expert, I'm going to say, well, okay, I buy 500 components from that supplier, and this supplier has 25 factories. So exactly what do I go do a risk buy on? right? So it's very, very difficult to act based on just environmental sensing. Environmental sensing is important, but it is not, I think we all understand in direct materials that you have to take that sensing information and crystallize it into relevant information about which of my suppliers are operating or dependent on this area, or maybe they have some secondary suppliers that are operating or dependent in those areas. Translate that into a prediction of exactly which of my products might be affected, which of my manufacturing sites might be affected down the road. And that then allows my experts, at the end of the day, we are not at a point yet, I should say yet, where we are autonomous. Our supply chains are not autonomous. They're not making decisions on their own. It's experts applying human intelligence, their knowledge of the global supply chain, their industry and suppliers, how easy it is to replace or qualify another source. Things like this need human intelligence and expertise. And if we can give these experts this outside-in data and knowledge of what's going wrong and how this might affect you and by how much, now these experts have enough information to make very prescriptive and decisive action. And so we actually have a case study on this particular thing in the next slide and I wanted to today talk about, we are talking a lot about COVID, but really it's time to look past COVID because there is a world of disruptions beyond the coronavirus. And the reality is that supply chains are going to continue to be disrupted. So what we are talking about here is what are the necessary capabilities that we really need in order to continue to survive, not only survive, but thrive in this continuously disrupted environment that we live in. Here's an example in the life science, pharma, and healthcare industry where one of our customers, actually several of our life science customers at the time who had been mapping the supply chain using our capabilities where we are collecting data, as John mentioned, about where are the suppliers manufacturing, which parts are made, stored, or distributed at what sites worldwide, what alternate site does the supplier have that can cover operations for those parts, and where are they located, and how soon can the supplier start shipping from those locations. When we combine that data with the sensing capability, in the case of Hurricane Maria, one of our customers, this is before Maria even made landfall, identified that they had 30 parts coming from a couple of suppliers in the Puerto Rico area. Now, this is really important because at a part level, I can quickly go and check, do I have sufficient inventory? Which will cover my 3 to 6 month requirements. And if not, then I can narrow down from 30 to the 4 parts or 5 parts that I need to go do a risk buy on. And it is precise, it is surgical, and most importantly, it is less expensive than trying to go do a risk buy on 20 million dollars of everything you buy from that supplier. So in this case, they were able to identify the 3 or 4 parts, in particular this one FDA certified plastic bags that came out of sites in Puerto Rico, one site in Puerto Rico that apparently a lot of companies were highly dependent on. And our customers, because they had the mapping data on top of the monitoring information, were able to have their internal team secure emergency budget, and within 4 days of Hurricane Maria's landfall, they knew that the supplier was hugely impacted. They had already identified where they would secure this inventory from. It was a distributor, et cetera, that had the inventory. And before people realized that this particular IV bag or FDA certified bag was going to be disrupted, our customers were there and they placed their risk buys. So this is the arbitrage opportunity for the folks in the audience that are finance experts. This is information arbitrage. This is giving you data that is actually very easy to collect. And we've certainly done it, as you can see from our data set, more than 350,000 factories that we have mapped to the 3 million parts across many, many industries. gives you this type of arbitrage opportunity, which we saw in play during COVID. As countries began to announce lockdowns, or even as cases began to appear in different countries, we were able to start preparing our customers ahead of time and say, if cases grow in this country, here's how many supplier sites, products, and parts are potentially disrupted. And so by each country, as this coronavirus event grew, our customers were ahead by having all this data available to secure supply chain quickly. Rob, any comments or examples on this one from you?
Yeah, no, this is a great example, and I think this company had a great sort of operations center as well, where they were looking at these events, and I think that's the really important part of technology such as Resolink, is it's able to collect information from a variety of different sources, and understanding what are the things to look out for. So initially, the seeds are put in by humans, but then once you can automate the data collection and then start to use the technology and the machine learning technology to help understand where the stuff is happening, you can collect a lot of information that's of interest and map it through GPS data. At the end of the day, as you point out, the human is still in the loop. You need to have humans making decisions and being able to take that information and to act early. And one of the things certainly we've learned from COVID and other disasters is, the quicker you can respond. If you can respond in January or February instead of March, you're gonna get a jump on the event. In the case of COVID, it could save lives, and it can also cause you to take actions that can help prevent a lot of the problems from happening. And I think that's key. It's that you need to have those decision makers that are able to use that data, understand it, interpret it, and be able to act on it. And that's something that I think is going to be a really important capability going forward, post-COVID and into the future here as well.
Yeah, thanks. I think, I agree. This was a great example. Even outside of COVID, we lose track. We're so stuck in the moment, but we should look back and know that, as Bindya mentioned, we have the first named storm. We're already seeing storms. Hurricane season is now on us, and let's not forget the lessons from the past, which is another reason why we wanted to include this one today. Why don't we? I think one of the things that we wanted to also cover and discuss, and this has been an ongoing theme around kind of the workforce. And Rob, I think you wanted to cover today sort of your observations and on this topic. So I'll let you lead it.
Yeah, so I think along the lines of what we were just talking about, John. I think there's really a need for people to start thinking about what are the skill sets that people that are working in supply chains are going to need going forward. And I think historically we've worked off of sort of static information systems that told us, how much have we spent on things in the past? How does that map against our contracts? Maybe there's a little bit of, price forecasting and hedging, but a lot of the data that we've been using has sort of been backwards looking. I think we're moving much more to, to a real-time data environment with technology like Resolink and others, where we can start to actually see, what's happening right now, what's happening in our facilities, what's happening in terms of inventory, what's happening in terms of material flows, what's happening to material that's in transportation or that's sitting in customs. And, when we see material that's not moving and we see some of the risks surrounding that material, we can start, taking action. We can bring people in, we can examine the data, we can collect additional information, we can create context, and we can understand what's happening. And I think more and more we're going to be working in a real-time world. And I think in the future, the holy grail, of course, is to move to predictive, or what I call innovative data leveraging. And this is information where you can start to conduct, what if analysis or wargaming scenarios. And this is where you take, historical distributions of data, comparing data from multiple data sets, and starting to be able to say, well, what might happen, or what would happen if under these conditions, or if we move to these our supply chain over to this part of the world, what would be the impact of that, and what would be the cost? And I think this is really an important question right now because, as we're seeing, we're moving away from globalized supply chains. And I don't think we're going to be moving necessarily to all localized supply chains, but I think a component of that will certainly be, there will be some localization of supply chains. There's Democratic bills in the Senate that's focusing on localization of healthcare supplies. I think the Strategic National Stockpile, I've done some work on that, looking at more of a national security conversation. National security is also impacting things like Huawei and other electronics. So there's a lot of activity, a lot of events going on right now. And I think we need to start looking at our supply base, where our suppliers are located, what's happening in our supply chains, both from a legal, environmental, risk-related perspective, and start to make those decisions on, what could happen or what might happen. And that's a different kind of skill set than what we've had. In the past, we've sort of just monitored, shipments or looked at spend. But I think, given that supply chain is in the news, this is a real opportunity for procurement supply chain people to step up the game and really be part of that discussion of where we go and what we do from here.
I completely agree, Rob. And I think just, think back maybe 10, 20 years ago, a lot of the work if you ask procurement, what is 80% of the time it's spent doing cost reduction and cost negotiation with suppliers. I think that is a little bit of the reason why we're in the situation we're in here today. I think we've spent way too much time just trying to drive costs out of the supply chain and not really worrying about what is the reverse impact of this completely lean and completely cost optimized supply chain that we have built. And we're not suggesting, and certainly ResLink is not suggesting, that everybody should now nearshore and manufacture onshore. There are many reasons to do manufacturing offshore. Your demand, sometimes the fastest growth area is parts of Asia. And so and suppliers are close to parts of Asia. So, and certainly risk is not limited to Asia. Risk is everywhere. There's risk here as well in the US. In fact, 25% of ResLink's Event Watch alerts are US centric. So it's not that the US is risk free, but the reality is that we went too far to the cost side. And so I think it's really time to realign. And I think that if you look at the, how we look at the continuum of risk mitigation approaches, the onshoring is one of the most expensive ways to do risk mitigation, right? Because it takes billions of dollars to set up a factory. TSMC now in the high-tech industry, we saw last week or so announcing a factory in Arizona. It's a minimum of $15 million to do that. And that's assuming you can get access to unlimited water, unlimited power, all of the clearances from the EPA, et cetera. You talk about holding more inventory. That is hundreds of millions of dollars in risk mitigation spending that you would have to do. But data and getting data, it's a couple of $100,000 investment. And it allows you to have the most cost optimized lean supply chain while still thriving in the uncertainty and allowing you to manage your supply chain across any kind of disruption. That's really the future, I feel. And, having a group of people within supply chain with the ability to be comfortable working with technology, working with data, using these new types of insights and environmental sensing and all these types of alerts and making decisions proactively and designing supply chain in a more cost and risk optimized way. I think that's the future. I think it really is one of the reasons why we work with NC State and Georgetown and many other universities is we see that the need for a different type of skill set that is a lot more savvy working with data technology, advanced analytics, and predictive modeling and things like that is the call of the future. And that's what makes procurement, takes us away from being just a cost center within the company to being the hub of transformation.
And one thing sorry, Rob. One thing I was going to also comment, I think from a lesson learned is kind of linking this. Obviously, the workforce side is really important. And one of the things I think we've also learned and are doing more work in engineering on our side over time is the collaboration and communication lines with suppliers also, as people got locked down, moved away, had to work from home. I think there was we're looking at collaboration, adding more and more collaborative capabilities with suppliers, because I mean, you can clearly see as from a workforce, people ultimately, our people in the supply chain need to communicate with their suppliers, and that some of that broke down, during this crisis. And I think having, not only predictive analytics at the top there, but also kind of improved collaboration and communication, I think is also really important. And then we've observed that. All right, I'm going to go on to the next one.
Yeah. I think this theme of workforce and new skill sets is really important. And as you point out, Vinny, I think we're in a world where increasingly we're going to have to collaborate. We're going to have to use data to collaborate. I think more and more people are going to be working from home, honestly, following this COVID crisis, and that means that more than ever we'll have to collaborate, and we'll be using data to make aligned decision making. We won't be, all in a meeting room together. We'll be looking at data, and what we've seen is, part of the challenge to using data for predictive analysis and for better decision making is really about bringing the right team of people together. And what we've seen, for instance, at a lot of the companies that we interviewed that are sort of a best practice. Is they're starting to create these analytic centers of excellence. And this is from a CAP study that we did a couple of years ago. And what we see is, you need people that really have that deep analytic tool set, the quant jock who can, work with Dataminr or Tableau or Microsoft BI or Python or R, who really, can work with these very large data sets and be able to merge data sets and understands how to combine data. You also need someone who really understands the technology issues, the market issues, the subject matter expert who's been out in the field, who can really interpret the data and tell you what it means, and maybe has that experience and that knowledge and that business acumen to understand that. And then I think the third category of person for an analytics team is the interpreter. And the business person and the quant jock probably can't talk to one another, so you need someone to kind of interpret between the two. And there's some really interesting components of being able to do that well. You have to be curious. You have to look for interesting patterns. You have to look for interesting kinds of observations. But most important among that is being able to ask the right question. If you can't really define the problem from the outset of what it is you're trying to solve, or look for, what is the predictive scenario that we're trying to understand, what are the scope and what are the components of that? If we can't bring that together into a team that can really define the problem and solve it by looking at data, we're not going to be really successful, or we're not going to be leveraging the full power of what the data can help us with. And I think that's important here, and that's why we're so excited to be working with Resolink, because our students are just terrific. I'm constantly amazed by the insights they come up with in working with your data and other people's data as well.
And I think the understanding of different types of data and the interrelations and linkages, that is basic skill set, I think, in the future, because we will more and more look at different types of technology, different types of tools. These tools will give us different types of predictions or prescriptive suggestions on what to do. And we can't obviously always blindly follow, because not all the data elements that are needed in order to make a prediction are always nicely there within any one system. And so being able to kind of really synthesize, understand the gaps, the pros and cons of, what system you're using, and the accuracy of the prediction based on the availability of underlying data, I think these things are going to become very critical. And so having that kind of mindset and analytical thinking, I think going forward is going to be very critical. John, next slide. I think we only have a couple of minutes.
Yeah, I was just going to suggest we're getting near the top of the hour.
Yeah.
So we always bump up ahead of it. Go ahead, Rob. Sorry.
Yeah. So let me kind of summarize here. I think, I think this critical thinking piece is really important, understanding it. And in a post-COVID world, a few people have asked, are we moving away from just in time? Are we going to be moving to localization? I really don't believe so. I think what we will start looking at is, can we be more globally independent? And I don't think any time that we're going to be moving from China or Vietnam or Bangladesh, especially in places like apparel. I mean, that's where the apparel sector is. And likewise, the electronics sector is in China and Southeast Asia, in Taiwan. We're not going to be suddenly, bringing those facilities over here to the U.S. I think what we might see, however, is we might see the movement towards kind of a pan-North American hub. And I think Tom has talked about that as well. Where Mexico is really dominating as a low-cost hub. And they also have free trade agreements with, I think, 4 dozen countries around the world. So they've really become a hub for automotive. Canada obviously has a lot of natural resources, and the U.S. obviously has a lot of capital. So I think we may be moving more towards a pan-North American type of supply chain when it comes to localization. But nevertheless, we're going to have to, find ways to work with our global partners, after this goes by. I don't think there's an easy answer to this, but I don't think we're going to be moving suddenly to localization, despite the the number of edicts coming out from Washington, D.C. But it's really been a pleasure to talk about this. So.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Rob, I think there's one methodology Resolink has certainly seen and worked successfully, which is to stop thinking about your supply chain just purely by spend and start looking at your entire product mix in terms of revenue impact and what suppliers or which parts of your supply chains affect the maximum ability to deliver value to customers. So when you start looking at that, to give you the example of PPE, PPE is not high spend. It is actually less than 5% of the spend, but from the time a patient walks in the door to the time the patient leaves, you need PPE. So the value or the impact of not having PPE is far disproportionate. So when you want to make these types of decisions about just in time or near shoring or where to put more inventory or where to manufacture what, looking at the revenue impact of not having something is a much better way to business justify cost of mitigation. So just some prescriptive ideation here on how to make these very difficult choices. And it's not by what you spend on, but what is the impact of not having it available, and how difficult would it be to fix the problem later on? What is the cost? What are the resources? And that tells you how much available money you have to spend on mitigation. I think, John, that's it from me.
Yeah, I was sorry. I was just gonna suggest that we move forward and wrap up for today. And unfortunately, we were like other times we have run out of time. We will follow up for. We did get a few questions. We'll follow up with you from the panel to address those. I think one thing we did want to again thank our first responders. Those who, we get quite a few of folks in kind of healthcare, life sciences in particular who participate in these webinars. So again, thank you all to them, and thanks everybody, even the people that are now starting to open up, local establishments for all of us and restaurants and stuff. So thanks a lot for doing that. And I think with that, we'll wrap up for today. Thanks everyone, and please join us in the future as we continue to give you data updates and more insights over time. So thanks again, everyone.